Welcome to Moments with Marianne. This is your host, Marianne Pastana. And we're here today with special guest, Dr. Don Trent Jacobs, 4 Arrows, who's here to share with us his new book, Restoring the Kinship Worldview. Indigenous Voices Introduce 28 Precepts for Rebalancing Life on Planet Earth. So can Indigenous wisdom help heal humanity? Well, today's show is going to cover just that. Dr. Don Trent Jacobs, otherwise known as 4 Arrows, is the author of more than 22 books on Indigenous worldview, education, and wellness. Recipient of Martin Springer Institute Moral Courage Award, he was selected by Arrow as one of the 27 visionaries in education, former Director of Education at Lakota College and tenure AP at NAU. Currently, 4 Arrows is a professor in educational leadership for change at Fielding Graduate University. So let's welcome to the show, 4 Arrows.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. And Mishante Atawa Wogala Ketnat na Pechus et Pelo. I'm telling you and your audience that I'm speaking from my heart this morning and offering everybody a warm handshake. Wahink Petopa Amachi Apielo is I'm saying my name is 4 Arrows. My Irish name is Don Trent Jacobs. The name Wahink Petopa is Lakota. I had a near-death experience after the Marine Corps back a long time ago. And my near-death experience was trying to kayak down a river here in Mexico where I live that was uncharted. And the river disappeared into an underground hole and took me into it. People can go on YouTube and put in the shaman's message and see the narration and the photos of the voyage. But afterwards, I was rescued by the Raramuri people, the Indians of the Copper Canyon, who live in a canyon that's deeper than our Grand Canyon in the United States. And I was so impressed by their lifestyle, living in caves for the most part, by their joy, by the way they interacted. I came back, had a vision that caused me to stop my clinical psychology work and teaching hypnosis at UC Berkeley. And I went and got my doctorate in education, specializing in Indigenous worldview. And from there, I went to Oglala Lakota College as director of education. And there I met with a group of sun dancers, became a sun dancer, and was made a relative of the Oglala Lakota and the medicine horse Teoshpaye. And so, according to the ceremony, which is one of 7 of the sacred Lakota ceremonies, which includes the sun dance, the vision quest, the purification lodge, etc., the making of a relative is really serious. And so they tell me that my spirit won't go to my Cherokee ancestry, which I have with my mother's relatives, and nor to my Irish relatives from my father's side. I will go to Lakota land. And so my spiritual path as a pipe carrier is as an Oglala Lakota, though I do not have that blood. And so that's my story. And it's my pleasure to talk to you about why I believe our original worldview, which really belongs to all of us, because I call it indigenous because of the indigenous cultures that are still against all odds holding on to it. And there are fewer and fewer that are able to hold on to it and their language and their cultural ways. And so I make a distinction between this place-based wisdom that a few indigenous cultures still have, and pockets of them have within cultures that have largely lost it. Like, for example, I have 14 Navajo students getting their doctorate at my university, and they tell me that 75 to 80% of their nation, the largest in the United States, have really lost their way in terms of the language, the ceremonies, the worldview. And it's a sad thing. But so we got to do our best to support sovereignty and those indigenous people who still have this amazing wisdom of their land, of their location. But in the meantime, we've got to re-indigenize ourselves with what we're going to talk about today, and that's worldview, and the indigenous worldview as a non-binary contrast to what we'll be calling our dominant worldview. And that's something that belongs to anyone who is indigenous with a small I to planet Earth, which I think would probably be most of the people listening.
Well, thank you for taking the time to share that with us. And I just find Lakota language so fascinating. I just love hearing that. Is it something that is also being taught where people can learn that, the Lakota Nation can learn?
Yes, they do now have Lakota teaching platforms online, and they've created a Lakota dictionary. And as tragic as the loss is, there is that effort, and it is a beautiful language. In fact, if you don't mind, I like it that we typically, when we start an important conversation like this or a meeting, we typically open with a prayer to tune people into the recognition that we are related to all living things on life, and that we wish for the outcome of this interview to bring health and rebalancing to our world. May I do that?
Of course.
Otunkashila, wakantanka namakompo na tatewa topo na unshimaka, ahituayanke, oyate oyasin chankuluto ochnamane ovechakipo. Oyate oyasin unshiwichalapo na oichakipo, helpful with result. Stay. We are Tungasha, oyate oyasin unshiwichalapo na oichakipo, hechuitozani washte and what big deal. Ihani lakovich wanki tunkashi the kiksu. Natako yoyasi. Aho.
What was the inspiration for writing this book? I know there's so much that this world is so out of balance. And you talk about that in your subtitle, Rebalancing Life on Planet Earth. What was the inspiration?
Well, this is my, I think, 23rd book. And I've written about Indigenous worldview, starting with, I guess Primal Awareness, which was the story of my first trip into Copper Canyon. Yeah, so I've written, I wrote, my first book was Primal Awareness. I also, my daughter and I wrote a book on character education from a Lakota perspective. And went on from there to realize that this idea of worldview, that was really a German concept, a German philosophical concept that really stifled debate. It was really about science versus religion. And of course, now, if you put in worldview, 90% of the books on Amazon are just about religions, claiming that they are the worldview. But Robert Redfield, back in the 1930s from the University of Chicago, really brought it into the academy. And he is saying essentially that, there's two worldviews. And a worldview is something that describes the human relationship to nature and to what we might call supernature, or to the metaphysical world. And he says, really, there's only two. And people get into serious conversations. They either talk about, we're human-centered, or we're seeing sentience in all life, or we're spiritual, or we're materialistic. And so over the years, the scholarship has revealed these very significant precepts, if you will, things that we follow that are deeply embedded in us, that create our cultures and our religions. In other words, worldview is an umbrella over religions and cultures and philosophies, and most of each fit under either the indigenous worldview or our nature-based worldview that we left about 10,000 years ago. And that's a whole other story I write about in my book, Point of Departure. And the indigenous worldview that that we had was changed into this separation from nature, if you will, and that's the source that was causes the imbalance that we have. And so, by putting together 40 precepts that have been, in the scholarship that define the two, we have a non-binary contrast, and people can go to Kindred World online and see that and buy the chart, or I can send it to them. It needs to be looked at, though, as a non-binary, sort of a continuum, like the left and right brain, if you will. And that, we have to realize this union of opposites between, say, hierarchy and non-hierarchy. We are living in our dominant worldview is essentially a hierarchical worldview, as we all know. Most indigenous cultures throughout, hundreds of thousands of years were matriarchal and non-hierarchical. And yet, during a buffalo hunt, the Lakota become hierarchical, and appoint somebody to be the leader. And so we have to look at these two worldviews and say, well, how do we bring balance back into my being, too didactic in my work, or too emphasizing of rights instead of responsibility, or having rigid boundaries instead of flexible boundaries, or lacking empathy, and all the things that we see in the worldview chart. It's about getting back to that. And so, because the interest was starting to grow, I could see. I thought, let's do a book that really discusses these and get Indigenous voices to introduce examples of at least 28 of the 40 worldviews, which is what we do in the book. And from that, I'll invite my dear friend Darcia Narvaez, who really is a developmental psychologist who brings this worldview up to from infants maybe up to age 5, and then I'll talk about how we change the older population than that, and let's see what happens. And so we were just delighted when the University of California, Berkeley, is their prestigious center for the greater good, Science Center for the Greater Good, selected the book as the top science book, one of the top 15 science books for the year 22, for being thought-provoking, inspiring, and practical, which really makes us understand that people are starting to become aware of this concept of worldview. And that's really what the book would inspire it.
In your and we actually found you through that too, with the Greater Good Center there, and really appreciate that we have that connection. What in your book you talk about that we need to have a fearless trust in the universe. What does that look like, and why do we need to have that?
Well, I'll give you an example that I gave to somebody last year, and they came to visit me at my place up in Tokwa Indian Land on the west coast of Vancouver Island, and it was a little foggy that day, so I took them down to a creek that has about a 30-foot embankment that you can jump into the river right by a waterfall. And it's kind of scary, and where bears go up and they catch salmon that fall out of they're trying to make their way up to up the falls. And we like to go there, and there's a jumping off spot that jumps right into the base of the falls, and it's safe, it's beautiful, and my grandchildren do it. But I took a fellow there one time, and I said, "You want to come up and jump?" And he goes, "Oh no, I'm afraid of heights." And I said, "Well, let me see. You can watch the kids do it for a while. You can see it's safe. You can swim, and it's a lot of fun if you want to do it. You're welcome." Well, he finally said, "Well, I want to try it." And I said, "Well, the first thing you got to do is you got to get courage. And courage is really an important thing for Indigenous peoples. And so, you take this courage and it'll get you up the rock, and it'll get you up looking over the edge. And then you're going to need more courage to think about actually jumping." So sure enough, he got his courage, and he goes up there and looked over the edge and lost it and wanted to turn around and go down. And I said, "Well, just get in touch with how logical is that?" This is something in the dominant world, for the most part. We see that fear usually shuts us down, and we don't like fear, and that's we're in a fear culture all the time, and it's become chronic. And then the people that do exercise courage is usually about fighting. It's fighting against the system. Whereas in Indigenous worldview, the highest expression of courage is generosity. And think about giving away, your prized puppy to the family next door who just lost theirs or something like that. So courage is really valued. And I would give a little say, if you're afraid of jumping into this water when it's safe and you wanted to do it, then that you've got some other things in your life that you're probably afraid of doing. So he got kind of motivated philosophically, and he went up and he jumped all the way down. I could hear him scream, and he hit the water and got out. And he said, "Oh, that was amazing! Oh, never again!" But that was amazing. But I said, "Never again? Why? You just proved it to yourself." And he said, "Oh, it's just too much." I said, "Well, let me teach you something about how to move from move from courage to a trust in the universe." And he said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, that's the next step that Indigenous peoples take. That's why Indigenous peoples live without fear of death." And he says, "Well, what are you talking about?" Because he came here to learn from me. And I said, "Well, let's go up again. And you can do that, right?" He says, "Yeah." I said, "Okay." I said, "Well, now when you're that last time when you had your feet on the edge and you were looking down, you had to use courage to push yourself off, and you had to maintain that courage all the way down. And that was what the emotion was." I said, "I want you to do it again, but this time, as soon as your feet leave that rock, as soon as you make the commitment to act on your courage, I want you to let go of the emotion of courage and move into a deep trust in the universe. Just trust. You just did it, and you know how easy this should be. Just trust the universe." And I sort of talked him into it with sort of some hypnotic language. And he walked up to it, and I said, "Just close your eyes now. Now open your eyes, and on the count of 3, I want you just to make a commitment with a full trust in the universe." And he jumped. And he hit the water, and he came out. And what he said to me was, "This was unbelievable. Unbelievable. I didn't see anything the first time. I saw an eagle flying overhead as I was coming down, and I saw a salmon in the water. I felt the air like it was in slow motion. And when I hit and plunged down, I felt the bubbles coming up around me. I felt the coolness of the water and the rush of the current from the waterfalls pushing me down. I felt the enthusiasm of grabbing the rock and pulling myself up. It was just so different. And I just can't think of a better way to answer your question than to Marianne, than that story, because it really, all I've lived with and been with cultures like the Kunchak of Sonora and the Raramuri of Mexico, and I've recently visited with the Kogi Mamas of Colombia, and I see this in every way. I see this fearless trust in the universe as it relates to some of the most trying and difficult situations. And I think we can learn to do that. And we start when I have people do a ceremony, a Nipi ceremony. When we finish, we go out to the ocean, which is only about 90 steps away here in Mexico. And I said, what I want you to do is just walk silently out to the ocean and walk into it without any hesitation, whether it's cold or whether there's waves coming. I want you to walk out with no hesitation, and then just plunge into the water. And imagine that as soon as you touch that water, that's your death experience. Maybe you're getting hit by an airplane or a bus, or maybe you're dying of a disease, or you got whatever. I want you to practice what it would be like to die at that moment. And then just allow your body to plunge and float into the water as if that's the next realm that you're going to enter. And feel the beauty. Imagine the beauty. I experienced it in my own near-death experience. And I didn't know about Ray Moody's dissertation and the thousands of people on his website that have described their near-death experiences. I didn't know about University of Virginia's perceptual studies program and how one of the Nobel Peace Prize winners said that their research is as good as anything in quantum physics and what they show about life after death. I said, if you get rid of your fear of death and dying, you'll get rid of your fear of living and loving. And it really is about this movement from courage into this really trust in the universe once you make the decision to take action on the courage.
Well, Four Arrows, thank you so much for explaining that. How beautifully said. On that note, we're going to pause here for a quick break. We've been speaking with Dr. Don Trent Jacobs, Four Arrows, in regards to his new book, Restoring the Kinship Worldview. We'll be right back after these messages from our sponsors.
Every day, pets are surrendered and abandoned. For these helpless and hurting animals, Paws Humane Society acts as a voice for the voiceless, providing hope for a brighter future. You can make a difference in the life of a shelter pet. Become a humane hero today. Just $10 a month will provide much-needed food, shelter, medical care, and love. It takes a community. It takes heroes like you. Together we can. Together we will. Together we are Paws Humane. Visit pawshumane.org to be a hero in every animal story.
Are you an actor, public speaker, or an executive telling your story over Zoom? Jean-Louis Rodrigue and Scott Weintraub's new book, Back to the Body, takes the process they use to coach top Hollywood talent like Margot Robbie, Jack Black, and Ke Huy Quan and makes it available to everyone. Using your body and its energy as a point of departure, your work will gain an enhanced level of performance and depth. Back to the Body, available on Amazon and wherever books are sold.
I'd like to thank Jason Eastwood at Guitarfulness for sharing his inspiring music and talent with us. His music is known worldwide for cultivating atmospheres of harmony, inner peace, and clarity. Visit Jason's website at guitarfulness.com. Join his newsletter, be part of his community, and download his music. Welcome back to Moments with Marianne. We're here today with special guest, Dr. Don Trent Jacobs, Four Arrows, in regards to his new book, Restoring the Kinship Worldview. Indigenous Voices Introduce 28 Precepts for Rebalancing Life on Planet Earth. Well, you've been talking about, kind of touching on something that I want to expand with you, which I think is a huge fear in our society, which is death and dying. How can people move from this place of the fear that they're in to having this trust in the universe?
I think that's where spirituality comes into this. In the Indigenous Worldview Precepts, we talk about we live in either a materialistic worldview or we live with a spiritual worldview. We live with an anthropocentric, human-centered, society-based language, or we live with a way of being in the world that recognizes movement and sentience and this egalitarian perspective on life. And when you begin to understand the spirit world that is around us and the energies in that spirit world, and you begin to look at Carl Jung's work, if you want to go into Western science, on synchronicity or your own experiences of things happening that are beyond coincidence. And whatever your religious tradition is, somewhere in there is this idea of a spirit. Now, in the Abrahamic religions, the idea of the spirit, coming back, like as in reincarnation, whether you're looking at Eastern interpretations of it or a study recently done in British Columbia by some scholars called Amerindian Rebirthing, who interviewed children under 9 who had claimed to know other families and things like that. They actually came back. It was cedar trees and frogs and salmon and humans equally, about 40, 60%. So we don't really know about these things, but there's a sense in how we live for millions of years on this planet that life in nature recycles one way or the other. And because that's what indigeneity is. It's recognizing that we are homeless. We are part of nature. If you look in a dictionary, like Webster's dictionary, and put in the word nature, and it will say everything but human beings and what human beings make. That's how far away from nature we have separated ourselves. But when you're part of nature and you recognize these recyclings, and then you have origin stories that come from different tribes, and they all talk about we are bodies inhabited that are inhabited by spirits, and that whether you call it a soul or a spirit, whether you look at the research on how it might seem to be continuing on somehow, whether you look at the amazing evidence that relates to reincarnation stories, somehow, all indigenous cultures I've studied, and I've studied most of them, we leave our bodies, we go up into the Milky Way, and we are part of a decision as to what we're going to do next. And that can be someplace in the multiverse. It can be back on Earth as a creature. It's a great mysterious. All the words for what we be calling God in the Western culture in indigenous languages ultimately translate like they do in Lakota, Wakantanka. It means great mysterious thing. First of all, it's a verb. Most of the indigenous languages are verb-based and they're nature-based. If you walk through British Columbia, every time you come to a different flora and fauna, you will find a different language. It comes right from nature. And so this idea of a great mysteriousness doesn't stop the idea that we are souls and spirits. We just don't know exactly how it works. But I believe that having that sense of a greater sort of scope allows us to move greater into this idea of trusting the universe. I was recently up at University of British Columbia presenting. This was just before the pandemic, so I guess a couple of years ago. And when I was done, someone in the audience says, well, do you believe that if we can re-embrace the worldview precepts to rebalance our world, like you write about in your book, that we can turn things around? And Marianne, it just came out of me. I said, no. And they went from loving me to hating me in that moment. It looked like, and the hands went up and somebody, said, well, why are you here? You give away your royalties for your book, so you're not making money from it. Why are you traveling and doing all this work if you don't think it can turn things around? I said, because I want to be a human being. People kind of looked at me like, what? Well, I had written a little monograph before this book called Sitting Bull's Words for a World in Crisis. And he had been interviewed one time after, when he was with Buffalo Bill Cody, after he had gone through the horrors of what he went through. And he was well known for his generosity, his humor, his songs, his poems, his kindness, his continuing his sun dances. Even when the smallpox had wiped almost everyone in his family and his community out, and the buffalo were all killed, etc. And that was his answer. He says, because I keep wanting to be a human being. I think that's a powerful idea. And I said, I think we need to change the definition of hope. We're facing a sixth mass extinction. And the UN report, the largest study that ever came out of May 2019, says we're going to lose 1 million more species in one generation of flora and fauna. You can read my article in The Nation called "The Media Missed an Important Message" in the UN report and see some of the details. But the UN report says that where Indigenous worldview is operating, the extinction rate is absent or severely reduced. How can we not look at that if you've been brainwashed into anti-Indianism and you're into science? Look at that, and it'll share with us this idea. Well, the worldview is about spirit and being spirit and being connected to spirits in the trees, in the rivers, in the mountains, and in all living creatures. And once you have that spirit, you can redefine hope. Not as a certainty of an outcome, but the certainty that what you're doing is the right thing to do, regardless of the outcome. And that could take lives, not just generations, but it could take, coming back and continuing the work. So it's, I think without that spirit, it would be very difficult if we think that, that things are over when they're over. Certainly they are on many dimensions. So there's mourning and there's that tragedy. But I think that trusting the universe really kind of calls for this larger understanding of interconnectedness with everything. And that means with the cosmos and the spiritual energies that are in it.
So in your book, you have a topic that actually goes through community. So how important is community for us?
Oh, it's so important because it is a way to practice this kind of living. It's a way to practice this generosity, which is the highest expression of courage. It's a way to learn about yourself and why you're here. And what your purpose is. Everyone has a purpose. Everything has a purpose. That mosquito that is coming in the room has a purpose, right? And you got to decide, do I need to kill it or not, right? And it doesn't. There's no right or wrong in it. It's just the thought process of community. But it's bringing the non-humans into community. And so when we talk about community, almost all your readers are thinking, oh, this is my work community or my neighborhood where I live or my sports community. That's part of the problem that we're facing, is that we have lost our sense of being in community with the pigeons and the leaves and the trees and the weeds growing up through the concrete, or the star peeking out of the polluted sky, or whatever part of nature you still have access to in the world. Until we can recognize that that's part of community, then we really are missing out on the essence of who we are. I gave a presentation with 3 experts in soil at a university a couple of years back, and I went last. I had been asked to come and talk about soil from an Indigenous worldview perspective. And these 3 professors were just excellent in their abilities to describe the importance of soil from a scientific perspective and on human survival. So I got up and at the end, and I kind of looked over at them and I winked and I said, well, I learned a lot from these guys, and this science is good and it's important and it's going to be important for our futures. But then I said, but it's not going to do any good. I kind of, the audience all looked at me like I was being insulting, but, they laughed and I laughed. And then I put a slide up. And in that slide, I quoted Roosevelt, who created our national parks. I quoted Gandhi, and his amazing philosophy. And I quoted Wendell Berry, one of the great environmentalists. 3 people that I respect their ecological perspectives. And I read them. And in each one, I said, this is what the scientists just taught us about how important this is. I said, but now read this quote from Chief Seattle about soil. And I read it. And I said, compare that to the three from Gandhi, Berry, and Roosevelt. And compare that to what our professors have said. And tell me what's different. Well, I let the audience have it. And the audience got it. And they came back and they said, oh my gosh. In his words, he's talking about the memories of the soil beneath his feet, the ancestors' blood in the soil, the feelings of the soil and their love for the human being. And it went on and on. And, just in the, and it was the same amount of sentences that the others had written, that Chief Seattle had written. But it was a completely different perspective on soil that the audience got. And I said, imagine living that way 24/7. And I oftentimes have gone around the world and with Buddhist monks, I've gone in and I've said, before we start our talking today about Indigenous worldview, I want you all to go out and touch a tree out there in the corner, or the plants over, I'll have predetermined where there's some growing wildlife, or the flowers over there. I just want you to touch them and come back. And so they'll kind of, depending on who they are, look at me kind of funny, put their notebooks down, and they'll go touch it and come back. And before they sit down, I go, hey, don't sit down yet. I want you to just do it again. But this time, I don't want you to just go out and touch it. I want you to go out, take a moment, and you're going to laugh, but try to take it serious. I want you to ask your permission before you touch that plant or that tree. And I want you to wait for an answer, and almost everybody just kind of raises their eyelids sometimes. Maybe the Japanese monks didn't, but you get the idea. And so they went out there, come back. Well, I've done this, 100 times around the world. And there's always a tear when somebody reports out what happened. It's just amazing, just that one little exercise, the kinds of results that come from it. And again, I say, how would you imagine life if you lived that way 24/7? That's what community is about, and humans are a part of it. Probably I'm kind of ashamed to say this, but 30 years ago, as an environmental activist, I remember thinking and saying that humans were a cancer to the planet. You hear that a lot. I'm so sorry for that. As I've learned about and lived with Indigenous worldview, we're children of Mother Earth in the same way as all of the other creatures. You look at the research on the Amazon rain basin of 13,000 years of amazing human interaction and impact. Humans have always had impact on nature, but it was all positive. They created black earth from their waste. They planted trees in the right places. They did all kinds of things, but there were no extinctions, right? And there wasn't the greed. There wasn't the separation from nature. It was all integrated as part of being one with the natural world. That's what we've got to do to develop community.
It's community on such a bigger worldview, and I really appreciate you taking the time to share that with us, because it's looking at everything as a sentient being.
Yeah, there was a book that was published called A Discourse in Character Education about 10 years ago. Cultural Wars in the Classroom is the name of it. And I was, like I said, my daughter and I had written a book called Teaching Virtues, Building Character Across the Curriculum, using a Lakota approach that for each course that was taught, you would have in your lesson plan what the requirement was of the state as number 2. And number 1 would be one of the virtues: patience, fortitude, courage, humility, honesty, fortitude. And talk about how that played out in the topic that you were about to talk. And that how, when the Indigenous people are going to go out and make a bow and arrow, that they would talk about how they're doing this so they can get food for the community. And So in this book on character education, they looked at every one that had gone to the U.S. government and been approved. And they said it was either didactic and conservative and religious based, or it was about creating new systems of critical ways of looking at social systems in a more moralistic way. And then, to my surprise, they said, before we close, we want to talk about one that was not approved by the federal education administrations. And it was one by Don Jacobs and his daughter, Jessica Jacobs, AKA, Four Arrows and Jessica Jacobs. And in it, they look at character as not coming from religions and not coming from social systems, but coming from the animals. And they go on to talk about how they think that this is something that was really important. And, the authors have become friends of mine over the years. But this idea of, like you say, of expanding that community. I don't think it's a coincidence, by the way, that children's stories are about morals are almost always taught by animals. You ever notice that? But we sort of let that go as we become adults, and getting that perspective, and even in places in cities where nature is few and far between, there are places to go. And I recommend for people to really utilize this just from your little program is something I call the cat and the fawn connection. I won't go into the details. The cat was something that was a mountain lion that rescued us out of a cave on our escape from the canyon when I had my near-death experience, and a fawn was being carried by one of the Tarahumara, who was carrying a fawn over his shoulders that he had killed, whose feet were bleeding because they're great runners, and he ran it down, and it was on his shoulders as he was showing us how to get people on a path to get it out of the barrancas in this 8,000-foot canyon, and so the cat and the fawn became, in a vision, neon lights in New York City, and over the years I interpreted it as concentration-activated transformation. That's simply hypnosis. Understanding that we are killing our planet because of hypnosis. It's early childhood hypnosis. The first 5 years, we're essentially in hypnosis all the time. That's why we can learn 10 languages. And the things that we learn are the things that are keeping us from being in balance. Or it's a trauma experience. But then at the same time as this natural emergency hypnosis book I've written talks about when people are in fright during the first hour, they're hypersuggestible. Indigenous people understood the power of self-hypnosis. And that's what ceremony is. We did ceremonies all the time. That means intention, going into a lower brainwave frequency, and having an intention that you imagine deeply enough so that you come out more generous, more strong, more able to follow the laws that work. And so using the cat, which is the self-hypnosis, which is simple to do, you can learn it so easily. You don't have to pay somebody like me that taught it at UC Berkeley. Back in the days, it was $300 an hour. You can learn it yourself. But what are you going to do with it? That's the question. Well, take fawn. Fawn are just 4 of the ideas in the worldview: fear, authority, words, and nature. And look at how the dominant worldview deals with each of those. And you know that, and you can figure it out. And then look at the indigenous worldview and see how they look at fear, authority, words, and nature. I mean, words are sacred vibrations. You can't be deceptive with them. Nature is our teacher. Fear is an opportunity to practice a virtue. Authority only comes from honest reflection on lived experience, recognizing that everything is related. 4 completely different ways than we do in the dominant worldview. Now, once you can recognize the problem that you're facing, whatever it is, and how it relates to fear, what fears have caused your actions and your beliefs, on whose authority do they come from? What words do you use when you talk to yourself about it or to others? And in what ways have you not used nature or used nature to help you understand this? And now when you get the aha, do self-hypnosis to begin to reframe your thinking and then go out and practice it. Now, that's a 2-week course I just gave you in 5 minutes, but I think if your readers get the worldview chart, read the book, and you'll see we talk about cat fawn in it a little bit. You have a very practical way of beginning to rebalance your life and rebalance the social systems and the educational systems and the entertainment systems so that they can begin to reflect who we really are.
You have so many amazing stories that have been contributed to this book. How did you decide what would be part of the 28 precepts?
Well, that was challenging. That was for sure challenging. And some of the precepts were hard to find good quotes for, so they could be eliminated. But so I think Darcia said she's going to do 14 and I'll do 14. And we just kind of chose them from our own, what we thought would be good for the first book, right? And it was just a matter of our own preference of what we thought we could find the best opening quote for from an Indigenous voice, and then what we would have the most exciting dialogues. And we dialogue afterwards. For people that want to get the Audible book in audio, my grandson actually is a professional actor, and he read all of the Indigenous quotes, with a different accent and a different style. So each one seems unique, while I played the flute behind him. And then Darcia and I we have our actual real dialogue with each other. And we don't always agree on some of our interpretations, which makes it, engaging. But it's an option for your readers, your listeners.
Oh my goodness. It's 4 Arrows. I just love this book. Where can our listeners connect with you and be part of your community and learn more about your work?
Well, my wife has put together a website, it's 4arrowsbooks.com but it's so hard to keep updated because I'm doing so many things. I was just invited by the American Psychological Association, who has really been an enemy of mine. I've written against that organization and their history of eugenics with American Indians and stuff. But there's good people in it too. And I thought that I said yes. They wanted me to write an article on decolonizing psychology. And of course, this decolonizing movement, your reader needs to know, is about indigenizing, because decolonizing is about pre-colonizing, and pre-colonizing is about the nature-based worldview. So I'm going to write a 15,000-word article for the General Psychology Review, which is the highest ranked of their papers. And so these things are keeping me busy, and you can find them by just putting in Google or YouTube 4 Arrows, Don Jacobs, Indigenous Worldview. And I think there's about 25 pages that will come up where people can look at free, interviews like the one we're doing.
Well, and your website, 4 Arrows Books, is your wife did a fabulous job on it. It's a great starting point for people to connect with you as well.
Oh, I'm going to tell her you said that. She'll be appreciative.
Well, 4 Arrows, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Well, thank you very much.
Well, thank you, 4 Arrows. It's been such an honor to spend this time with you and to talk about your new book, Restoring the Kinship Worldview. Indigenous Voices Introduce 28 Precepts for Rebalancing Life on Planet Earth. Restoring the Kinship Worldview is available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and everywhere books are sold. And remember, support our indie bookstores. You can also purchase this book directly from the publisher, North Atlantic Books. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in. You've been listening to Moments with Marianne, where we make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.